Well, as we continue to go through the Believe in Our City event that we had recently, we had a panel that we tried to raise the elevation a little bit, raise our eyes a little bit to think about our country and the context in which our city exists and how we got here, the good and the bad. And so it was a great conversation. Jeff Rosen from the National Constitution Center moderated it. He's always fantastic at that, with Jamel Bowie, David French, and David Bobb, who you'll hear chiming in. And I think it was particularly interesting as we think about as Americans celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence here in the not too distant future, and really start to think of this, the American idea. What's it mean? What did we do well? What did we do poorly? And because this idea, the American idea, is a magnificent idea, but the implementation of it had some flaws. We've started out poorly in some cases, and it was done by people who had flaws, like me, and probably like you too. We're all in this together, and we want to be better. And so I thought it was a good discussion and dialogue back and forth about some of the things we can celebrate our country and some of the things we can learn so that we can make things better. The whole idea of this conference was that we improve, that we deal with the challenges that we're facing, but we find better solutions so we can live better lives together with our neighbors throughout our community. And so this was a great panel discussion. I think you'll find it very helpful.
We believe, and have always believed, in this country that man was created in the image of God, that he was given talents and responsibilities and was instructed to use them to make this world a better place in which to live. And you see, this is the really great thing of America.
It's time to discover what binds us together, and finding it has the power to transform our world. That's what I believe. How about you?
Hello, friends. I am so excited to share with you the light of this spectacular panel on this crucial question about the successes and failures of the American idea. This panel builds on a convening that we had in Miami not long ago about this topic with Jamel Bowie, David French, and Charlie Cook of the National Review. Charlie wasn't able to join because of his plane being delayed, and we're so honored that David Bobb for the Bill of Rights Institute has taken the Charlie Cook seat, although without the really compelling British accent that made everything that Charlie said so memorable. I want to begin this crucial question that we're here to discuss. Why should we believe in the American idea? And do we still believe in the American idea? In Miami, we discussed how this is a time when people on the left and the right are rejecting the American idea and raising the question, should we break up with the founders? Were they so flawed in betraying their ideals that they no longer deserve our allegiance? So I want to start with that crucial question. Jamel Bowie, in recent pieces, you've discussed both how we shouldn't reflexively accept invocations of the founders in Nebraska's decision to change the way it allocates its electoral votes. And then you had a very powerful piece about the fact that we have not just one founding, but two, and that starting in the founding era, Black freedom fighters and others invoked the Declaration of Independence to say that America should live up to its ideals better than the founders themselves had. So I'll start with that question to you. Should we break up with the founders?
Yeah, I like to think of, the way I like to think of this question is to kind of ask and response, like, who do we mean by the founders? Because I think there's a tendency to kind of imagine a quite narrow and one-dimensional kind of like American political tradition that goes from, like, Jefferson, Madison, Washington to all the familiar faces through history. But there are like multiple American political traditions, and I would say that there are multiple founders and groups of founders. There are the people with whom we are familiar. And perhaps I think there are reasons to sort of like take a bit of a more complicated look at them. And there are many people for whom we collectively are not as familiar, but who had a profound impact in shaping our notion of what the American idea is. And so, like, to talk about the Declaration of Independence, for example, today, right, the opening words of the Declaration are immortal. For a good chunk of American history, they weren't irrelevant or anything. People still thought they were important, but they didn't occupy the kind of prominent space in, I think, Americans' idea of themselves as it does now. The way we get from the Declaration being one important document among many to really being considered the foundational American document is through the work of people who I would describe as another set of founders. The abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, William Garrison, the whole, this entire group of men and women who were fighting a very lonely fight against the institution of slavery and were looking for whatever resources they could find within American culture to make the case for human equality. And it's these group of people really who elevated the Declaration into what it is today, and who elevated it in a way that led more mainstream politicians, people like Abraham Lincoln, for example, to turn it into this powerful statement of American civic religion. And so, for me, when you ask, do we need to break up with the founders, I would say there are maybe a few for whom we can say maybe we don't need to spend so much time on them, but there's a whole world of Americans who have been trying to, you could say, refound the country again and again through every generation. And I think those are people that we should be paying much more attention to, because we can learn quite a bit about both this country and about political change from just observing them.
David, should we break up with the founders?
No, but we, to connect with the previous panel, we need to see them as men and not monuments. And I think one of the ways that we have responded to the founders is we have both simultaneously lionized them and infantilized them in an interesting way. So we've lionized them for all of the things that the beautiful statement in the Declaration, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. We look at the text of the Bill of Rights, which I think is one of the great declarations of human rights in history, short, concise declarations of human rights in history. Or we can look at the Civil War amendments, which finally began, unfortunately did not complete, but began this process of extending the blessings of liberty to all American communities. And we can respect that, and we could admire that, and we could admire the thought that went into that. But where we infantilize our founders often is we look at them as people of great wisdom who couldn't really know better when it came to slavery, or didn't really know better when it came to some of these other issues of injustice. So on the one hand, there are people of great vision and wisdom who didn't know better. And that's not the case at all. That's not the case at all. One of the things I appreciated, Jeff, about your book, Pursuit of Happiness, was how it talks about these founders often were quite aware that they were not living up to their values. Not all of them, but some of them were quite aware that they were not living up to their values. They were quite aware of fights and arguments about slavery and abolition. And so I think we need to look at them as people in full and admire what is genuinely admirable, but also understand that there were many elements of their lives and biographies that were not admirable at all. And also, I think we can use that to flip the mirror around to us a bit. How many times do we not live up to our values? And is the excuse really that we don't know better? Is that really the excuse? Or is the excuse very much like the excuses a lot of the founders had? Expedience, personal prosperity, ambition, greed, wealth. All of those things played on the founders' minds as well as it plays on ours. And so I think we can learn a lot about not just the founders themselves, but really the dualism in American history, where you have these high ideals that clash with a harsh reality. And all too often the harsh reality defeated the high ideals. And we need to teach all of that together, and that's not breaking up with the founders, it's understanding them more completely. And that, I think, is a key not just to understanding that historical period, it's also a key to understanding ourselves and how we as people now in 2024 are often divided between our highest ideals and our base ambitions. And this is something that we see constantly in American politics now, is we see that people know full well that these high ideals exist, and yet pursue the most base of ambitions in Washington, in many ways in exploitive and dishonest ways. And that combination is not alien to our founding generation at all. So don't break up with them, but know them as the actual flesh and blood people and not the monument.
That crucial distinction between the ideals and the institutions has indeed run throughout American history, and you make a very powerful argument for why we need to teach history whole in all of its complexities to understand that tension. David, the Bill of Rights Institute is doing such important work in teaching those ideals to learners across America. Should we break up with the founders?
No, but I think we should really think deeply about to what we're attached. You know, we know Martin Luther King's speech on August 28th, 1963. Have you read John Lewis's? In his first draft for that speech, he said this: "Get in and stay in the streets of every city, every village, and every hamlet of this nation until true freedom until the revolution is complete, until true freedom comes, until the revolution is complete." He was asked by the organizers of the march to temper his remarks, and he made a number of changes. And what he added to this, which is interesting, is at the end there of that statement, until the revolution of 1776 is complete. I think that in many ways suggests some of the tension that we're in today. The revolution of 1776, John Adams was asked in 1818. A businessman wrote him and said, "Hey, we're losing our veterans. They're dying every day in droves. What was the thing that you fought for?" And Adams' answer, I think, is instructive to your question, Jeff. He said the real revolution was a change in our opinions, our affections. It was a change in ideas. And it was a radical thing. That's the word that Adams used. Radical means you're going back to the roots of the thing. Let me bring in one other person here. I think the man of our hour might be Frederick Douglass, because I think what he suggests to us that the attachment is not to the people, but to the principles. What you want to think about, Frederick Douglass said when the nation was turning 76 years old in 1852, he gave what I think is probably the most remarkable speech in American history. What to the slave is the 4th of July? And the first half of the speech is devoted to the fact that for him, an enslaved man, it's your country, your founding, not mine. And as he moves forward in this speech, what he begins to articulate is the big change that was coming in his own view, where he said, we got to believe in the principles of the Declaration. They're our saving principles. They're everything. But the Constitution also is a glorious liberty document. And that was a big shift for Douglass. What he was saying is, be attached to those principles. You can study the men and women who forged the revolution, who fought it, but think about what those saving principles mean for you. And I think that's the task that we have at the Bill of Rights Institute. That's the one we share with you in the National Constitution Center, in telling America's whole history and doing civics in a way that's honoring those saving principles.
Beautifully said, absolutely right. And as you so powerfully suggest, teaching the principles and how throughout history people have lived up to them or not, and teaching it whole is exactly our urgent mission. All of you have talked about how those principles of the Declaration, liberty, equality, and democracy, are indeed at the heart of the American idea. I want to explore whether we still agree on the core of those principles, and in particular take the question that divided the Union during the Civil War, and that was the constitutionality of secession. Jamel, you wrote a really powerful piece recently suggesting that Nikki Haley and Greg Abbott recently suggested that secession was constitutional. And you said that violated the settled understanding embraced by Lincoln, John Marshall, Alexander Hamilton, that we, the people of the United States, made the Union and that it is indivisible. Tell us about that argument and why you believe that the Union is indivisible.
Sure. The argument against secession that Lincoln made, and Lincoln is kind of building on a previous generation of politicians and legal thinkers who are arguing against kind of ideas that lead up to secession, right? The secession crisis in the 1860s doesn't just like emerge out of nowhere. There's nullification in the 1830s. There's like rumblings of secession in the 1850s. All this is kind of happening. There are attempts at secession, although not Southern secession, in the 1810s. So it's like part of the American political landscape, this idea of secession, and do states have to stay in? And Lincoln's argument is twofold. The first is that, and he's building off these previous arguments. It's that the states didn't create the Union. That's sort of like the crux of it. The Union wasn't created by the states. The ratifying conventions might have happened in the states, but that's kind of incidental. They happened in the states because they had to happen in the states. But the states didn't create the Union. The people of the Union created the Union. And so if there's anyone who can dissolve the Union, it really is only the people at large. And the other part of this is that no political organism, no political structure, no state contains within its rules like the mechanisms for its own unmaking, right? It doesn't make any sense that we would create this democracy or this republic and then kind of smuggle in there a bunch of rules, a bunch of mechanisms that would let you completely unravel it. And so Lincoln says secession just doesn't make any sense. I wrote about this in the context of some new stuff, but I think it's still relevant in part because I think as we're all aware, there is this sort of Civil War like ideation or fantasizing that's happening. There's that movie that recently came out called Civil War, and it's not really hard to find survey data of Americans saying, oh, we're headed towards civil war, or hey, violence might be necessary to get our political, the political settlement that we want. And the reason I think it's relevant is that I think the argument against secession reminds us that in fact there is nothing we can do really to just completely break apart and have our own thing, each of us. We actually do have to figure out some way to live here together and to deliberate and come to solutions together, and to not just live together, but live with the fact that some of us do have kind of like fundamentally different ideas about what this country should be, and fundamentally different ideas of what liberty and equality and freedom even mean. What I conceive of to be freedom is something very different than what some other group of Americans conceive to be freedom, and that's just something we're going to have to negotiate as like equals in this society. And it's not a thing that we can say, oh, well, you can just have your own country. Like that's not, for practical reasons, and I think for like kind of deep-seated and deep-rooted reasons, it's just not going to happen.
David Jamel is suggesting that people throughout American history can disagree fiercely about the meaning of liberty, equality, and democracy, but violent insurrection violates the Constitution and the rule of law. And Jefferson and Hamilton disagreed about whether we were a compact of states or a national people, but the Civil War, Jamel suggests, settled the question and suggests that secession is unconstitutional. Is that right? Is the question settled? And you've written so powerfully recently about violence on campus and the line between civil disobedience and violent insurrection. Does that line remain a bright line? And does the Constitution forbid violent insurrection?
Yeah, if you're talking about sort of the Constitution from an originalist standpoint and sort of do states have a right to extricate themselves, that would be a rather important detail to put in a Constitution, wouldn't you think? That if there was going to be a right of secession, that would be articulated and outlined. It's absent from the Constitution entirely. This is a union, and it is. I have this great fun. I teach at my alma mater, a small Christian college in Nashville called Lipscomb University, and I teach a class of lifelong learners. And these are folks. I'd say the median age of the class is about 75, and they're the best, by the way. Like, there's nothing better than a classroom full of people who are absolutely voluntarily there. Like, no one made them come. And I was talking about the Civil War, and I said, so this is an older Southern audience, and so you sometimes, if it's anything like my education, I did not learn anything other than lost causism in school until college. Okay, so you're talking about people who've grown up almost certainly steeped in sort of lost causism. And so I said, I want to say this about the Civil War. Unequivocally fought over slavery, unequivocally because of slavery. This isn't controversial, shouldn't be controversial. Just read all the secession documents. They were not lying to America when they articulated why. But it also settled a grammatical question. United States is or United States are? And it settled it in its United States singular. It is one entity. It is one country. And so if you're looking at it from a conceptual standpoint, constitutional standpoint, it's one country. If you're looking at from the standpoint of the Union Army being able to point to the scoreboard, it's one country. Like, it's one country at this point. Now, I agree completely with Jamel that a lot of this Civil War ideation it's just dumb. I mean, it's just dumb. It's not thought through. It's idiotic. Like, people don't even understand often their own communities. However, if people hate each other enough, they will do spectacularly dumb things. Just spectacularly dumb. And the thing that really worries me in this country is this rising animosity to the point where you just don't even see the other side as a human being. This is one of the things that's so wonderful about this gathering. You have people from across the political spectrum here, united by love of a city, love of a state, love of a country, and willing to work together towards common ends. That's the antidote. That's the antidote. Because if you retreat back online, the hate machine starts building. And I try to be I'm not a hateful person. I try to approach every human being with a default presumption of affection. But like, I'll open up Twitter and I feel anger rising in me just at the sight of the website. I'm angry when I see the bird, and then now it's just, who am I going to be angry at and so I do think that we are at this position where there's enough rage and anger in this country to where we almost thoroughly dehumanize each other, and then often begin to embrace the ends justify the means. The biggest scale version of that we saw was the January 6th ends justify the means. To, quote, save America, we're going to storm the Capitol. You see smaller versions of end justifies the means some places on campus where you don't have an exercise of free speech, you don't have true civil disobedience where people break an unjust law and then accept the consequences. They're breaking just laws and refusing to accept the consequences, which creates an atmosphere that violates the rights of others. And so that's a version of ends justifies the means. And so if that takes hold as an ethos in this country, we will do spectacularly stupid things in the name of our own hatred. And that is what worries me more than any kind of conceptual, philosophical vision of the possibility of secession. More the raw, visceral desire to separate is something that I'm more concerned about.
That's such a powerful way of putting it, teaching that the opposite of the rule of law is the ends justify the means, and not allowing that visceral hatred to rend the Union. David, can we teach this principle that we, the people of the United States, made the Union and the Union is indivisible as part of our teaching of the American idea? Or is the idea still contested? And how important is the ideal of union to the Constitution?
It's everything. I think not only can we must. I think the principled and prudential aspects, Jamel, that you brought out in Lincoln's thought are suggestive for us today. Think of this gathering. One of the things that Lincoln teased out in terms of the practical ramifications of secession was, where do you stop? Can Grand Rapids secede from Michigan? Can entities within this city secede from the city? Right? There's a logical impossibility to this. And I think what we see in working with tens of thousands of teachers across the country, including nearly 2,000 here in this state and several hundred in this part of your state, is that it's that separation that is very difficult to overcome now. Kids are polarized as young as 11. They model, or they imitate the actions and words and things that we're doing as adults. And what we're starting to see is that negative affective polarization is you grow up learning who to hate, who to dislike, who to not have anything to do with. And kids pick up on those cues quite powerfully. Now, I think has been signaled already this morning, we are less divided than we think, though. Our elites are especially politicized and polarized, but we can reverse this. And I think what it takes is getting beyond that separationism to say, let's, in the classroom, take up the very question that we're talking about right now. Exactly. Confront it head on. Tie it into current events. Tie it into the things that young people are naturally curious about. And they are. This idea that teenagers are ignorant and apathetic is wrong. Sure, there's some that are. But isn't that our responsibility to draw them out and to give them a vision that they don't have to cluster, they don't have to self-sort, they don't have to squelch their curiosity? A Knight Foundation poll recently said that 56% of high school students feel comfortable disagreeing with their peers and their teacher in their classrooms. That means fully that 2 out of 5 high school students across the country do not feel comfortable. So we're walking on eggshells. And that, I think, right now is much more the greater threat than an all-out civil war.
Absolutely right. It's so true that it is urgently important to show how the Constitution applies in people's lives, to teach the most controversial questions in American politics from a constitutional perspective, and presenting all sides of these complicated questions so people can make up their own mind, and learning how to have the habits of civil dialogue on which the future of the Republic depends. I want to take up the hottest constitutional issue in the news right now because both Jamel and David have written about it, and give you an example of how, a model of how we can talk about these most controversial questions from a constitutional perspective, recognizing there are arguments on both sides. This is the question of presidential immunity. And the Supreme Court just had a very important oral argument, and Jamel, you were troubled by the arguments that some of the justices were raising, that the president is a king and above the law. Tell us what you thought of the oral arguments and what you think is the correct disposition of the immunity questions in Trump v. U.S.
Yeah. It's funny that this is you're bringing this up versus the model, civil discourse. This is maybe an issue where I'm not particularly civil on. Or I'm like, there's actually one right answer here, and other answers are wrong and bad. So the argument that the former president's lawyer made essentially was that the president has to have, there must be some sort of, if not explicit, and certainly implicit immunity for at least official acts that the president takes. Otherwise, the president runs this risk upon leaving office of vindictive prosecution, of politically motivated investigations, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's probably worth asking. There've been 44 presidents prior, and no one's had that problem. So is it really a problem, or is it just a problem for this one guy? But setting that aside, the issue with the argument is that there just simply isn't any constitutional or textual basis for it. And the one thing we have about the creation of the Constitution, about especially ratification, which I think is often left out in our public discussions of what did the founders mean, but there is this lengthy period of broad public debate, kind of unprecedented public debate over what the country was going to be, that had certainly a great amount of participation in terms of sort of voting and choosing who's going to be in these ratification conventions, but even people who weren't formally part of the polity, in the sense that they didn't have the right to vote, or they didn't have the right to participate, were still engaged in conversation about this. It really did consume the entire society. So we have all of this debate about the Constitution and every single provision within it from ordinary people, from all sorts of political elites. And at no point is anyone even vaguely suggesting that the president has criminal immunity from anything. In fact, the notion that the president specifically does not is one of the arguments brought to bear on opponents of the Constitution. Opponents of the Constitution are saying, listen, I think we're creating a kind of king. And proponents are saying, no, we're not creating a king. The president can be impeached. The president can be prosecuted. There's even, and I quote this in my piece, there's even George Washington's first appointee to the Supreme Court, in fact, says, listen, if the president were in a capital case, he could be convicted and executed. Like this guy is a citizen subject to the laws that we all are. And so, for my part, I think I've described this. I think I've described the immunity argument as being system breaking. That if a president, and Justice Jackson sort of suggested this as well in her questioning, that if the president does have immunity for official acts or any act, you've essentially created the conditions for just the kinds of power grabs that dissolve the entire system of government itself. There are no longer any checks and balances. If the president can, for example, suggest to followers that the election's being stolen, they should do something about it, and then say afterwards, well, this is just an official act. I'm just making sure that I'm just trying to protect the integrity of the elections. Like that is the path towards tyranny of the unambiguous kind. And so my argument in the piece, my argument whenever I talked about this, is just that there is no presidential immunity. There can't be, right? To think of it another way, the president is a specific civil office, right? It's a by definition a civil office subject to ordinary law and the higher law that is the Constitution. If you were to suddenly make the president immune to consequences of breaking either of those things, then kind of by definition you don't have a president anymore. You have something else. You have some other office, but it's not a president. It is something that exists outside the boundaries of lowercase r Republican government.
David, if this were a We the People podcast, I'd ask you to make the argument on the other side. And I want you to do that and then tell us what you think.
Okay,
Maybe closer to Jamel, but what is the argument in favor of some immunity for the president's official acts, and what do you think the right answer is?
Oh, boy. Okay. What is the argument in favor of the idea that the President of the United States retains a core royal benefit of monarchy? That's a really interesting argument to steel man. Let me do it this way. Well, Jeff, are you saying that, for example, you would like to have Bill Clinton brought into federal court for launching raids on the nation of Iraq without a formal declaration of war? Are you saying that you would like to see Joe Biden hauled in front of a federal criminal court in El Paso, Texas, for failure to secure the border? If we clearly articulate that we can allow presidents to be prosecuted in this highly divided, fractious society, which is different from the previous, it's hard to make this with a straight face, the previous 200 united years that did not have such high partisan tensions, that now in this new era, we could expect and see criminalized prosecutions, whereas before, and when America was more united, we would not have seen those prosecutions. Now it's a new era. We will see the prosecutions. I think what you see, and I'm kind of being a little facetious about it, because it is all a consequential argument. If you're talking about the argument for immunity, it's almost a purely consequential argument. If you do this, then bad things will happen. That troubles my originalist heart deeply, to make just purely consequentialist legal arguments. Because the core of originalism is really the text. I even dislike the term originalism in some ways, because it kind of implies that the time is as important as the text. The text is the most important element. And if you actually look at the text, My favorite part of the oral argument was the first opening seconds when Justice Thomas asked the attorney for the Trump team to say, what's the source of this immunity? What is the source? So if you're going to make a constitutional argument, what's the source? And he says, the executive vesting clause, Justice Thomas. Well, if you don't know the Constitution, it sounds like he had an answer right off the top of his head, the executive vesting clause. Well, you open up, oh, I'm very curious. The executive vesting clause gives the president immunity. It's like this long, and it says the executive power shall be vested in the president of the United States. That's the whole thing. And that's the basis for the argument. It doesn't have an and therefore the president is immune from all criminal prosecution under valid criminal statute. Doesn't have that. It just says he has executive power, period. And the next obvious question is, well, wait a minute, what about bribery? And that's what came up at the oral argument. Appointing someone to the office of ambassador, for example, is a core executive function. He has executive power. Can he sell it for cash? Well, the obvious answer is no, he cannot. He cannot. But it goes really deeper than this. And I think, just very quickly, you cannot read the Constitution without reading it as a thorough dismantling of royal prerogative. So they're coming out of a monarchy into a small r republic, okay? And so what this Constitution does is it systematically strips royal authority from the government. So there's this apocryphal statement that Louis XIV allegedly said, probably didn't. L'État, c'est moi. The state is me, or I am the state. And that really was what monarchy was. It was a person was the head warrior, the lawgiver, the judge, in many cases, the high priest of the society. He would exercise ecclesiastical authority. Our Constitution systematically strips that from any one person in any one branch of government. And then when it does give back some sort of limited prerogatives, like a pardon power is a vestige of royal authority, it's very limited pardon power. For members of Congress, they can't be arrested heading to and from Congress. They have a speech and debate clause immunity that protects their specific legislative acts, and that's it. So it rips away royal authority and gives it back in tiny little pieces that are specifically defined. And the idea that I would look at that document and say, President of the United States has all the immunity that George III had, strikes me as fantastical from an originalist standpoint. Though I do understand consequentialist arguments that bad faith actors could abuse the ability to prosecute a president. But you don't upset the meaning of it, you don't upset the text of the document because you disagree with the implications of the text. If you want to deal with the implications, revise the document, amend it. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about asking the Supreme Court to essentially amend the Constitution.
Can I just to add to that, there's a great example of exactly what you mean I mean, it's really going to happen, but I think the articulation of it's really fun in the movie Lincoln, where Daniel Day-Lewis, as Lincoln, is explaining to his cabinet, he's like, listen, the Constitution says I have war powers. It doesn't say what those are. So I'm going to do things that I think I have under the Constitution. But the Constitution doesn't actually say I can free all these slaves. I'm going to do it anyway as my war powers, but it doesn't say I can do that. What were to happen if after all of this, some judge decides that I have abused my powers? He wouldn't necessarily be wrong. So we have to pass an amendment to the Constitution to make sure that the powers I exercise are legal. And it's sort of like that's like real thinking that Lincoln went through. And it's nonsensical if there's presidential immunity. Like, why would you even bother?
Right.
Well, this is such a superb modeling of a civil constitutional debate on this most controversial topic. You're hearing both Jamel and David.
We weren't really debating.
Well, but you were exploring the tensions between originalism and pragmatism. And as David just said, you can make a consequentialist or pragmatic argument in favor of immunity, but that clashes with the original understanding, and we had a historical context, and now we're better informed to make up our own minds. David, the last word to you in this superb discussion, and it's just so exciting to bring Jamel and David together to model this sort of discourse. I know how excited we are together at the Bill of Rights Institute and the National Constitution Center about modeling this dialogue across America and teaching these principles. Can we take the most controversial issues before the Supreme Court and make them relevant to kids' lives in the classroom? And why is it important for us to teach the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution?
It's happening every day, and it's happening because teachers care about these things, parents care about these things. Parents are our first educators. They entrust their children to schools. And I think the kind of bonds of loyalty and trust that we have to rebuild are at the local level between teachers and parents to say, for a teacher, we're going to do viewpoint diverse. We're going to model civil discourse. We're going to do it. It's going to be hard, but we need parents to have our back. We need school superintendents and building principals to have our back and to be able to do that kind of hard work of delving into questions like this. But the good news is this is happening all across the country. And we see it every day. We see teachers who are doing an amazing job of running right into these most controversial of things because, why? They care about the next generation. You know, when Thomas Jefferson was penning the draft of the Declaration of Independence, he wrote a word down. And you know, if you ever use ink, we don't use ink as much anymore, where you really want a word to be disappeared forever, you cross over it and kind of blot it out. He did that with a particular word. And we know the word that he wrote in its place was citizens. The word that he blotted out and didn't want any subsequent generations to see was only revealed by a new technology that was done, I think, about a decade ago in the Smithsonian. And they stripped back the layers of his ink to reveal that the word was subjects. Civics is about moving from that mentality that would say we're subjects to citizen, which is the highest title in the land.
Beautifully said. What a powerful example of discovering the central commitment to citizenship that was at the core of the founding. I want to end by sharing this amazing quotation I've just recently found from John Quincy Adams about the importance of teaching the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. This was at the Jubilee of the Constitution in 1839. It kind of galvanizes all of us as we think about teaching these principles for 2026. And here it is. Quincy Adams says that the salvation or damnation of America will turn on whether we or not we teach the principles of the Constitution and the Declaration to our kids. And he says, lay up these principles then in your hearts and in your souls. Bind them for signs upon your hands, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes. Teach them to your children, speaking of them when sitting in your houses, when walking by the way, when lying down and when rising up. Write them upon the doorplates of your houses and upon your gates. Cling to them as to the issues of life. Adhere to them as to the cords of your eternal salvation. That's how important it is. He's quoting Deuteronomy and saying that the nation will be blessed or damned based on whether or not we teach these principles. And by bringing to America the kind of dialogue that you've just seen with thoughtful people who disagree about the applications of the principles, but are committed to the principles of the American idea, we can spark curiosity about those principles across America and start a movement to embrace them. In a moment, we're about to see Freedom Rising, which is the centerpiece of the National Constitution Center's way of inspiring people to embrace the principles of the American idea. We're so excited to bring it on the road. For now, please join me in thanking Jamel Bowie, David French, and David Bogg.